Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for today's Lunch and Learn. Just what is going on with offshore wind in Maine? Offshore wind represents a major opportunity for Maine's clean energy future and our economy. And in order to ensure that we do it right, Maine is creating a roadmap to develop offshore wind in a way that works for Maine's people, economy, and heritage. 4 working groups have drafted initial recommendations for that roadmap, and we have an incredible panel today to help walk us through them. Stephanie Watson joins us from the Governor's Energy Office, which is leading the development of the roadmap. Amanda Rector is Maine's state economist and a member of the Supply Chain, Workforce Development, Ports, and Marine Transportation Working Group. Bit of a mouthful. Dr. Damian Brady is Agatha B. Darling Associate Professor of Oceanography at the University of Maine at Orono, another mouthful, and a member of the Environment and Wildlife Working Group. And MCV's own Will Sedlack, who sits on the Energy Markets and Strategy Working Group and on the Roadmaps Advisory Committee. Thank you all for your service on the Offshore Wind Roadmap and for being with us today. My name is Kathleen Neal. I am the Director of Policy and Partnerships here at Maine Conservation Voters and Maine Conservation Alliance. Our organizations represent more than 13,000 members and supporters dedicated to protecting Maine's environment and our democracy. MCA does that through education, collaboration, and advocacy, and MCV by influencing public policy, holding politicians accountable, and winning elections. A few technical notes for today. We will hear brief presentations from each of our speakers and then tackle questions and answers for all of them at the end. You don't have to wait though. You can send your questions to me through the chat whenever they occur to you, and I'll keep track of them and ask them at the end. We do ask that you not message our speakers directly, as we want their focus on the conversation and not on the chat box. And since Will Sedlack is on camera today, we ask that you please message Francesca Gundrum if you have any technical difficulties. This event is being recorded and the video will be posted on our website later this afternoon, where you can also find recordings of all of our previous programs. Thank you again for joining us. And Will, I will turn it over to you to kick off today's discussion.
Thank you so much, Kathleen, and thank you all for being here. It's a little surreal to be on the other side of the camera and the program. I will say that this marks, I think, the second, or it has been 2 years since we've started this program, and it's just been an absolute delight to program these every Friday with Kathleen. I think we're over 18,000 people have either joined us on Zoom or watched later on YouTube. And I think this program is a wonderful reflection of kind of the collective brain at MCV. So thank you for being along for the ride. And I usually say this in the email, but if you have ideas for a program, please do reach out. But today we're going to talk about offshore wind, and that's another great part of my job. And so I'm here to kind of set the stage. And there's some great subject matter experts on this. I think I consider myself a generalist when it comes to offshore wind. I know a little about a lot, or a lot about a little, whichever one it is. But I kind of wanted to walk through and ground us on why Maine Conservation Voters has done just so many lunch and learns on offshore wind, and why it's something that we're so excited about. And I'm going to walk you through a couple slides before I turn it over to our other guests. And the first is, it turns out the climate is changing. I know we all know this. You wouldn't probably be on the MCV list if this wasn't something you were aware of. But as we know, I think we've heard this statistic a good bit. The Gulf of Maine is warming faster than 96. It could be higher now of the world's oceans. And we know that we have tough years ahead of us, but we can, as a state, do our part to avert the worst case scenarios. I think it is a moment of reflection where it does not have to be entirely doom and gloom. We have an obligation, a responsibility to move ourselves away from fossil fuels, but there's jobs to be developed. There's economies to be developed. There's futures to be developed, and there's ways of doing things better than we have before. And I think that's that's something that I really want to highlight for folks is there is joy to be found in this work. And I think offshore wind is a joyful industry that we can all get behind. And that's one of the reasons I really like working on it at MCV. Just to ground us, we've seen amazing leadership from the Mills administration on climate action. In December of 2020, the Maine Climate Council finalized a 4-year plan for climate action called Maine Won't Wait. And Maine Won't Wait laid out strategies for Maine to reach carbon neutrality, reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and transition to renewable energy by 2050. That setting goals and setting strategies is one thing, but it's a whole other thing to actually implement that. And what we know as advocates, what we know as people that are engaged in these processes is that we need to work quickly. We need to work in a way that is equitable, but that we're going to have to develop some renewable energy here in the state. Why offshore wind? I think this is a question I get fairly frequently, and I think the top level is that it turns out that New England's pretty windy, and especially our oceans. And so the Gulf of Maine is just uniquely positioned to be a great hub for offshore wind. There's a ton of wind out there. It is near population centers. We have a great population here in Maine. We have, the city of Boston and the greater Boston area. This is a combination of wind plus people is good. Offshore wind is also a great opportunity to diversify our energy sources, reduce emissions, and avoid the price volatility and, quite frankly, profiteering that goes along with fossil fuels. Something we've all seen at the pumps recently. And it's not the only solution to transition us away from fossil fuels, but is a huge part of the puzzle. I think that, really reiterating, there is no silver bullet. I think silver buckshot is one. I like to probably avoid any sort of gun metaphors, but I think this is one piece of one very large piece of a puzzle to get us away from fossil fuels. Why Maine? I think this is the other question I get fairly frequently. And Maine set some goals, and meeting goals is good. Meeting goals that are in law is extra good. And for us to meet our goals, offshore wind is a requisite piece of the puzzle. And I think there's also to the joyous part of it, I think something that Amanda's going to talk about is this could be an incredible opportunity for communities across the state of Maine to economically benefit from a new industry. In the same way that we get excited about biotechnology and the stuff that's going on with forest products and cross-limited timber. I think this is a place where Maine can really diversify and bring in new economic opportunities for the state. We also see this as a great place to shore up and to do great work with our partners in the unions in the state. One of the great things about my job over the last 2 years is how I've been able to work with organized labor in the state. They are raring and ready to do this work, and they're really excited about this. So I think as we think about what the jobs look like in the future, ensuring that they're good paying union jobs, I know is a top priority for MCV and for most, if not all of you on this call. Offshore wind is not a new thing though in Maine. I think this is the other misconception that I really want to address at the outset. I think I've heard from folks this is a flash in the pan. This is new for the state. I suspect Damian's got some gray hairs on his head because he's been working on this for so long. This is not a new thing for the state of Maine. In 2008, we had our first Maine Ocean Energy Task Force. In 2010, the Maine Ocean Energy Act. And in 2013, the University of Maine and Orono deployed their test turbine off of Castine, which was the first floating turbine in the United States. We had some setbacks during a certain administration that will remain unnamed, but offshore wind is something that we've been considering for a long time and have been seeing as an important piece of the puzzle for quite a long time. Just naming that all sources of energy have an impact on the natural environment and the current users. As we do things differently, that will have an impact. I think all human action has an impact on the ecology of place. And we really wanted to reiterate that the Gulf of Maine is a shared public resource, but it's also not just ours. I know that's a tough pill to swallow as Mainers, but it turns out we have to share the Gulf of Maine with other people whose name isn't in the Gulf state. So the Gulf of Maine also touches New Hampshire, Massachusetts, and some of our neighbors to the north. So, really thinking about this as a shared resource amongst states and amongst users is a really great way of just framing yourself at the outset. But MCV wouldn't be doing this work if we didn't believe that offshore wind, fishing, and conservation can coexist in the Gulf of Maine and in Maine shoreline. So that is an imperative for us. We believe that we believe and we know that coexistence is possible if we responsibly site. We do want to talk, though, a little bit, just as a grounding, about infrastructure. As we transition to a clean energy future, we're gonna have to invest in transmission lines. And offshore wind cannot happen without significant both transmission infrastructure, but also portside infrastructure. Just as a little background, Maine has 3 deep water ports: Searsport, Eastport, and Portland. And Searsport is the best position to be an offshore wind hub. If Maine's going to benefit from offshore wind, we have to build a port, just period, end of sentence. That is something that we're going to have to do. And so how we do that, how we build that out correctly, that's the discussion. That's what we have to work together on in the coming years. In terms of transmission infrastructure, this was a graph provided by a consultant for the state. It's a little jargony, of course, but I just want to say that, you know, when we talk about additional transmission lines and we talk about it in terms of miles, this range here is, you know, the low case is an extra 170 miles of transmission infrastructure. The high case is 2,835 miles of transmission infrastructure. So when we talk about this, how we balance this as organizations and advocates and people that are committed to conservation and protecting our natural environment, we do need to balance that with the need to build out a clean energy future. And that's going to be, those are tough conversations, but they're conversations that the Maine Conservation Voters are ready for, and I know you all are ready for too. We do want to say that MCV is really involved in this. In addition to our lunch and learns, we play a leadership role in many offshore wind kind of realms. I'm really honored to serve on the advisory committee for the roadmap. I also serve on the roadmap's energy markets work group. And Beth Ahern co-chairs the Searsport stakeholder process, which is beginning this month. And that's a process that those that are interested in what Searsport looks like in the future and how how things are developed in Searsport is one that people should really engage in. And I just want to kind of pause there and I wanted to set the stage for the other speakers, but I'm going to turn it over now. So I think Stephanie Watson's going to go next, and Stephanie's from the Governor's Energy Office. We're so lucky to have Stephanie in the state working on this, and we're going to hear about what the roadmap looks like.
Great, thanks for all that, Will. Let me see if I can share my screen. Really happy to be here. I'm a little under the weather, so bear with me. I'll do my best today. Okay. Can you see my screen all right?
We sure can.
Okay, super. Will was walking through a number of these big goals in his talk, decarbonizing, energy security, community resilience, and others that we have, like economic growth and resilience in the state of Maine. So there's a lot of planning and decision making that we all need to do together to reach these goals. And Will also mentioned that, we know we have a couple of pieces of the puzzle. We know that electrifying our most polluting sectors like transportation and heating are important. We also know that we need to improve energy efficiency. And we know that we can expand the efficiency and clean energy sectors in Maine. In Maine, we're also investigating all of these, and we're doing that with our stakeholders and through many new initiatives. On the clean energy side, we're exploring offshore wind, but also solar, onshore wind, and hydrokinetics. For today's discussion, obviously, we're focusing on offshore wind. And also, as Will mentioned, offshore wind is not a new idea in Maine. Maine has been a pioneer in offshore wind, and in particular, floating offshore wind for a really long time. I won't go through all of these different points, but it's just, I think, to illustrate that, we have been progressing in this industry and thinking about it for many years. There have been both public and private sector people involved. I wanted to point out one piece on this slide, which was the Maine Ocean and Wind Industry Initiative. And that was a public and private sector effort to get Maine companies that have capabilities in ocean and wind spaces to basically be marketed and connected to opportunities that are not only local to Maine, but also all the way through international markets. So there have been people looking at these industries as opportunities for the state for a really long time. And then, as Will mentioned, we had the UMaine 1/8 scale floating offshore wind turbine off Castine in 2013. And that was a major first in the US for a number of reasons. So first floating deployment is the first grid connected offshore wind turbine deployed in the United States. And it was also the first floating offshore wind turbine deployment permitted by any United States. So, you know, that's a pretty big deal. And that is that and all these additional pieces are capabilities and experience that we can build upon here in the state. So to ensure that we can build upon, excuse me, our history and capabilities, Governor Mills established the Maine Offshore Wind Initiative in 2019 to proactively explore a couple of things: how to best position Maine to benefit from an industry that's expected to generate $1 trillion in global investment by 2040, and then how to inform thoughtful development of offshore wind in the Gulf of Maine that respects our environment and our existing ocean users. So this initiative includes several components as listed on this slide here. And today we're really focusing on the planning effort, the Maine Offshore Wind Roadmap. With funding from the USEDA, excuse me, and the Maine Technology Institute, the goal of our roadmap is to identify how to best maximize the opportunity of the growing industry sector for the state of Maine. Again, that builds on our experience and also allows for coexistence. We have 4 expert working groups as part of this roadmap effort, and that's really where a lot of the work happens. We have both public and private sector representatives on each of those working groups, supply chain workforce, ports and marine transportation, renewable energy markets and strategies, excuse me, fisheries, and environment and wildlife. They are in the process of developing recommendations for the roadmap, along with support from technical consultants and additional public input. We also have an advisory committee that's comprised of public and private sector representatives with significant experience to bring to bear on different facets of offshore wind. And so as an advisory committee, the members are providing strategic direction on the roadmap, offering feedback and guidance to the 4 working groups on their recommendations, helping to identify and help resolve any gaps that we have or any need to align recommendations between working groups, and to help us identify key stakeholders for additional input and feedback. So we're doing this with a lot of meetings. If any of you have been participating, you know we have had literally more than 50 meetings of the working groups and the advisory committee from last July, so July 2021 until now. So incredible amount of work, a lot of effort from a lot of people. We have 96 members on the working groups and the advisory committee collectively. So again, a lot of effort, and we really appreciate everyone putting their heads together and figuring this out for the state of Maine. We have these initial recommendations that have been developed to date, and we are at the point where we are soliciting additional feedback on those, and there will be some information about that on the call to action at the end. And we also are, in addition to having the working groups do their good work, we have Also hired some globally experienced technical consultants through the roadmap to help supply the data and the information and the technical reports that we need to further refine those recommendations. And this is a listing of some of the reports that we're developing through those consultants that are helping our working groups and their recommendations. So the advisory committee itself has met 6 times to provide strategic direction. And we expect all of the initial recommendations that we are putting out right now to evolve with additional stakeholder input, more feedback from the consultants as that becomes available. And as the roadmap participants are now considering all the information before us. So we're still in an evolving process. In terms of where we are in this process, we're really finishing phase 1. We're actively seeking stakeholder input on the draft initial recommendations. And our next phase is to try to refine those, expand those, and develop a comprehensive draft roadmap that we can again put out for public feedback and comment over the summer. And I was asked to give a quick highlight of recommendations of 2 of the working groups, because I think my fellow panelists will cover the other 2. So this is the high-level overview of the draft initial recommendations for the Energy Markets and Strategies Working Group. So significant rationale and detail has been developed on each of these to date. This is really the high-level representation of those recommendations. So we have additional refinements that are happening to these. We also have new recommendations forthcoming. There are some additional topics that are under discussion, like transmission and permitting. So there's still quite a bit of work that's happening in this working group. And then just quickly moving, the Fisheries working group is another one I want to bring up today. So we have an active and engaged fisheries working group. Fishermen and fisherwomen are at the table along with Fisheries Association leadership, and they're providing constructive input to this process. Recognizing they're in a really difficult position, we very much appreciate all the input that they're providing, and the fact that they are attending these meetings and helping provide constructive input is really important. We also understand that they are not necessarily endorsing the concept of offshore wind, I think, which also really points to the fact that they are helping at least try to think through some of these difficult issues on a challenging topic. There's some significant rationale and detail, again, that's being developed under each of these 11 recommendations that are coming through the working group, and additional refinements and new recommendations are coming. There's some topics still under discussion, like navigation and safety, accountability, and cumulative impacts, just to name a few. So you can see here the co-chairs of this group are Meredith Mendelson from Maine DMR and Terry Alexander, who's a ground fisherman from Maine. And that's it. Just turning it over to my colleagues and look forward to discussing the opportunities for Maine and offshore wind with you all.
Thank you so much, Stephanie. That was really thorough, and as always, you give a great presentation. We're going to hear next from Amanda Rector, who I'll admit is a self-professed econ nerd. I think has one of the great titles in the state of Maine, which is she's the Maine State Economist. So Amanda, turn it over to you, and I know you got a presentation just to kind of ground us in what the economic benefit for the state might look like here.
Thank you. Yes. And hopefully you can see my slides that I have up on the screen. I'm going to talk at a fairly high level. I don't want to get down into the weeds too much here, but I did sort of want to talk about a few key points, sort of the top items that I see as the importance of offshore wind in terms of Maine's economy and the impacts on Maine's economy. The first thing that I really wanted to highlight is that Maine is incredibly reliant on fossil fuels. And the chart on the right here, this is just sort of one example. There are several different areas, we're a rural state, we do a lot of driving. So gasoline is another element of this. But in terms of the type of primary heating fuel used by housing units, so Maine is the second column here, and we use the most fuel oil and kerosene in terms of the share. It's a little bit over 60% of housing units using that than any other state. New Hampshire and Vermont are actually second and third, and you can see how far ahead of them we are, especially if you compare us to the US, where that's just that little tiny sliver down at the bottom of the chart. Much more of the US relies on either utility gas, which is, natural gas that comes directly to the home, or electricity. And so this really leaves us exposed to volatile prices in oil and price spikes in oil. As it stands now, our electricity system is reliant on natural gas, which is another volatile and increasingly expensive energy source. And so we really need to expand our access to alternative energy sources, not just for environmental reasons, but also for economic reasons. And this is the chart here on the left is just the daily price of one of the different oil. This is Brent spot price. And it just, you can see how much it bounces around and just how much it has been increasing recently, which in economic terms, if we're spending money on heating our homes and driving our cars and running our businesses, that's a lot of money that we don't have to put into other parts of the economy. So another aspect of this that I think is really important and exciting is that both the occupational needs and the supply chain needs of offshore wind, not just in Maine, but widespread globally, nationally and globally, could open up a lot of new markets for us. So if you think about floating offshore wind, the folks at the UMaine's Advanced Structures and Composites Center really have nation-leading expertise. That could bring in more college students to Maine. Certainly we have a lot of demographic issues here in the state. So the more college students we can entice into the state and ideally get to stay here, the better. But we could also bring them in, train them, and ship them off to other parts of the country and world to take that expertise. It could really elevate Maine's profile as a leader in floating offshore wind research and development. We have a lot of strengths in other key sectors that are related to offshore wind, marine activities, surveying and permitting, just a couple of those. That could allow us to export more of our knowledge and skills around the world. And if we can develop the supply chain, that really provides a lot of exporting opportunities for Maine-based businesses beyond just whatever might happen here in the Gulf of Maine. And in fact, some of those could be done sooner rather than later. Certainly, there are a lot of offshore wind projects that are taking place in other parts of the world and other parts of the country where we could start getting some activity and some involvement in the supply chains for those projects that are already underway. So this is, I think, one of the strengths of this from an economic perspective is that, Maine itself is a limited market. So the more we can tap into national and global markets for our workers and for our businesses and for the colleges and universities that can help train folks, I think the better off we are. The other piece of this that is interesting is that, I think we tend to think of offshore wind and we think of, oh, well, it's going to take place offshore. So clearly the coastal parts of the state are going to be the ones that are sort of most actively involved in the stuff that goes on with offshore wind. And actually, there are a lot of opportunities for economic benefits in different regions of the state, either through some of the training and educational opportunities for the workforce or through some of the supply chain elements for businesses. If you look at the map there, that's sort of the current unemployment rates. Blue is lower and the sort of reddish orange are higher. And you can see certainly down east tends to have some higher unemployment rates, and then around sort of the northern and western portions of the state as well. And the table that I have down here, if you think about some of the key sectors that are involved in the supply chain, construction, manufacturing, transportation, utilities, are sort of some of the related industries. Some of those parts of the state that have more expertise and more existing resources in those areas are also some of the parts of the state that have higher unemployment rates, and maybe a smaller share of the state's total GDP. So this is an opportunity to help spread some of the economic benefit to other parts of the state, particularly some of those parts of the state that are harder hit and really could use some additional economic development benefits. And so I think that this is a way to sort of expand our view of what offshore wind means and what that ecosystem looks like in terms of the supply chain that is feeding into not just what might happen off our coast, but again, as I was saying on the previous slide, global opportunities and national opportunities as well. And I think the last point that I wanted to make is that this development really aligns very, very closely with Maine's 10-year economic development strategy. And this was something that was developed late 2019, just in time for the pandemic to hit and sort of throw us off the rails at the beginning of this process. But I think that it was really, so it was a process to develop this strategy that thought about, for example, how can we find an intersection between global trends that are taking off and the existing strengths that we have here in the state to really produce some high value opportunities for economic development for the state going forward. So we're making investments in those places where we sort of get the biggest bang for our buck. And here, I think, the global trend that we're looking at, green energy solutions to address climate change, and this existing strength of our offshore wind potential, which Will mentioned at the very beginning, plus some of the research and development capabilities in terms of floating offshore and the workforce and some key occupations, we have the opportunities for some high wage, high productivity, high value jobs that can really help benefit Maine's economy across the board and really bring economic opportunities to a lot of parts of the state that could use a little extra boost compared to where they have been in recent years. And I put a link to the full report down in the bottom here if you want to go and check out what that economic development strategy looks like. And the idea behind that strategy is to help move Maine in a direction that's going to position us for economic strength and economic growth in the future. And that is all I have, and I will turn it back over to the other panelists for the next session.
Thank you, Amanda. And our last panelist is going to be Dr. Damian Brady from the University of Maine. And many of you have seen Damian's fabulous lunch and learn before on offshore wind and wildlife impacts. If you haven't, I mean, you have an hour after this to watch it. It's on YouTube. Go check it out. But turning it over to Damian to go next.
Thank you, Will, and thank you for tuning in. It was a pleasure to do this last year and talk about some of the technologies that are necessary when you start moving offshore, especially in the state of Maine, where we're going to be working towards floating offshore wind. So today I'm part of the Maine Offshore Wind Roadmap Environment and Wildlife Working Group. So I'm here to give you a pretty quick overview of what our initial recommendations are, but I really, really stress that this is still an ongoing process. We are still having meetings. They're all public, so you're welcome to join in and listen to the deliberations. And we make room at the end of any of those to ask questions or to put in your own recommendations for the working group to consider. I'm throwing my email address here down on the bottom. So if you've got questions specific to offshore wind and environment and wildlife interactions, please feel free to email me. So I won't belabor this because I think everyone has talked about this. Maine has a unique opportunity to lead here. Our working group is developing recommendations to avoid, minimize, and mitigate potential impacts. We have such a push and pull in this state when it comes to offshore wind development. It's pretty clear that we don't have an Atlantic cod fishery. We don't have a northern shrimp fishery anymore, certainly due to climate-related factors, but we also have a very robust American lobster industry, the largest single species fisheries in North America. And we have a very unique set of wildlife that uses this area. So we have this push that says we have to address climate, and the number one way to address climate is to take more fossil fuels off of our portfolio and more renewables onto our portfolio, but we have to do it in a responsible way. So these are the initial recommendations, and they represent the immediate needs to address critical data gaps and mapping of critical areas to inform future siting. Whereas the Mid-Atlantic and Southern New England have been thinking about certainly fixed bottom wind for a long time. Some of these baseline data that we need for better siting of wind in the Gulf of Maine still needs to happen. All right, so here's just a quick rundown of these recommendations. I'm going to go into a little bit of detail, but I definitely want to leave room for questions because I know there's probably a lot of good ones out there. So first of all, we have to bring together existing data. So I'll go into what we mean by that and map that so that we can do adequate siting. We have to collect Gulf of Maine habitat data. So that's the bottom types. One of the big things you learn, and I've been working on offshore wind since 2009. I think Will referenced my gray hairs when it came to this. So I've been working on this for 13 years, and we were very lucky and successful having our 1/8 scale turbine in at Castine for about 1.5 years. But it's really difficult to do these projects, and a lot of it is cable and transmission. So collecting bottom habitat in the Gulf of Maine, you'll see where we have good coverage and where we don't. Starting to collect baseline information. We're in a rapidly warming place. Yesterday, I was on the phone with a good colleague of mine from Bigelow Lab for the Ocean Sciences who studies kelp forests, and he was at Mount Desert Island, and he told me that the kelp forests that he brought a National Geographic photographer to were baked. Our last marine heat wave last year essentially took down probably one of our more robust kelp forests last year. So we're changing. And so we have to start collecting baseline environmental and wildlife information. Conduct tracking studies. This is our best way of looking at migratory pathways, how offshore birds are using offshore island habitats, what are their forage distances, how are we going to site offshore wind as it comes to interactions with avian, bird, and bat species. And then this may seem a little bit obtuse or a little bit in the weeds, but explore the use of federal consistency. Due to recent regulations, as well as just where the industry is going. This will all happen in federal waters. All floating offshore wind development off of Maine will happen in federal waters. So what say does Maine have in the development of projects that happen in federal waters if the transmission comes into the state? So these are kind of the overview of those recommendations. I'll get a little bit into the weeds on those recommendations, and then we'll open it up for questions. So we need to conduct a mapping exercise now to identify areas of greatest conflict between offshore wind development and wildlife, to identify those current data gaps. There is a lot of organizations along the coast of Maine, as well as through Massachusetts and New Hampshire, that have been collecting data in the Gulf of Maine, but getting it all into one place. There's some wonderful organizations like the Northeast Regional Ocean and Rock, and like NERACOOS, the Northeast Regional Association of Coastal Ocean Observing Systems, that collate data. We've got to bring it all together. We have the Biodiversity Research Institute, the Gulf of Maine Research Institute, the University of Maine, the Island Institute. So we've got a lot of institutions along the coast that have pieces of the story. We got to bring it all together. Critical areas of wildlife and fishes that should be mapped. So we need to know foraging areas for marine birds, like I said before. Migratory pathways, you'll see that in a second for the bird tracking. Areas used by ESA, endangered species. We need to map areas with deep sea corals. For those of you who don't know, the Gulf of Maine contains deep sea corals, and 300, 400 meters of water in the very deep areas, spawning and feeding aggregations of high priority managed species, and then areas of aggregation of Calanus, for instance, Calanus finmarchicus being the base of the Gulf of Maine food web for organisms like the North Atlantic right whale, which is highly endangered. Habitat data. So how much of the bottom of the ocean is mapped? Not a lot. We know more about the moon, it's often stated, than we do about the bottom of the ocean. All these patches in green on the left are where we have available very high resolution bathymetry. You'll notice that a lot of the nearshore coast of Maine is pre-1950 digital bathymetry. So these are in many cases soundings that end up on your nautical chart or your NOAA chart when you're going out on your boat. So collecting high resolution multi-beam data, particularly for areas where cables might come through, is high on our list in terms of the recommendation for habitat mapping. This is the baseline information. So what is out there right now? If we're going to consider mitigation, sighting in the future, what bird and bat species are out there? So integrated survey designs, nocturnal use of airspace by songbirds and shorebirds, continue general fund support for at least the current $2 million that's in the state budget, and seek additional state resources and funding to characterize wildlife in the Gulf of Maine. There are many reasons to have these kinds of surveys, just from the basis of biodiversity and change in climate in Maine, and given how much Maine depends just on the coast for tourism, there are reasons that this information will have multiple benefits to the state. Conducting tracking studies, there's a network along the coast called MODIS. So what you're looking at here is actually, these are nano tags that can be put on birds, and there are antennas all along the coast where we can track bird use. What I'm showing you right here in that white oval is the broad area of interest before it got narrowed down for the Maine Research Array. So we can start to overlap these tracks with areas that offshore wind development may take place. So that just gives you a sense of how this information can be used. Radar systems can be useful, marine mammal surveys, whale catalogs, bat acoustics. So these are paired echolocation devices that actually can listen for bat calls. So these are the kinds of information where we have these migratory pathways that we can use. This is where I said I didn't want to get into the weeds, but I'm just going to say that this is really important for the state. Investigate the potential benefits and process to use Maine's Federal Consistency Review Authority under the Federal Coastal Zone Management Act to address issues of concern related to offshore wind development. So this is also, I think, in conjunction with our neighbors, New Hampshire and Massachusetts. Will mentioned it before, but this, we have to consider what the implications are and the say that Maine will have in the development of these projects moving forward. So this is what's next. Transmission cable route and landing considerations, development of best management practices for monitoring. We don't want to get too prescriptive because we don't know what the technologies that will be available by the time any of these projects move forward. At earliest, the Maine Research Array, even if it's granted, is 2027. Any commercial project is certainly long after that. Procurement requirements and other ways to influence development and policy and provide input to the research consortium. We're still looking at recommendations. So these are recommendations that we talked about literally on Tuesday that we might add to our general list. Should we start monitoring for areas that may be potential offshore wind locations now? So one of our recommendations we're considering is funding to support pre-deployment monitoring. Stakeholder engagement with the BOEM process. We recommend that the state of Maine explore ways to provide an ongoing process for all Maine stakeholders to engage in the broader siting process. As part of the Gulf of Maine interagency task force, which is the New Hampshire, Massachusetts, and Maine. We highly recommend regional collaboration. The wildlife and fisheries in the Gulf of Maine don't prescribe to political boundaries. And so getting together with all the agencies and as well as the universities and non-governmental agencies, entities around the state, going to be very, very important through leadership and funding. Funding to support coastal protection and resiliency, to support the reinvestment in the Shoreline Economies and Ecosystems Act. Data accessibility, we're about to learn a huge amount about the Gulf of Maine that we never knew before, just from pre-deployment monitoring and baseline studies. So getting that data to be publicly accessible and useful to everyone is really important. And so we're going to have language in our recommendations about how to make this information publicly accessible. Formation of an advisory group, so a formal standing of an advisory group to further develop pre and post construction monitoring after the roadmap is over, as Stephanie laid it out. And there are lots of different ways that that advisory panel could be used, maybe most importantly in power purchase agreements between the state of Maine and those companies that are doing generation, transmission, and delivery. For the state to advocate for the use of guidance to BOEM when commenting on NEPA environmental assessments and environmental impact statements. So that advisory group could be Maine's voice when interacting during the NEPA, the environmental assessment and environmental impact statement process. Coordinated NEPA review, can all the agencies get together and have a coordinated review of these projects? And then a comment that we recommend encouraging BOEM to require all developers to utilize the latest technologies. All of this language is still in flux, and we're still trying to figure out what we can say as a roadmap advisory group and working group, but very, very happy for people to hop on those public working group calls and make your opinion heard. Last thing, funding for long-term research and mitigation and cable laying and transmission infrastructure. So with that, I want to make sure I left some room and time for questions, Will, but happy to ask anything, answer anything about our process and then what the future of offshore wind looks like.
Before I turn it back over to Kathleen and Damian, thank you so much for that. I just want to say, I think this is always a great gut check of, I've heard sometimes this is a process that isn't a process. The state isn't taking this seriously. I mean, we just spent 40 minutes and it could have gone for probably 40 weeks with all the great information and thinking that's been happening. So, I mean, for me, this really underscores just how thoughtful the Mills administration has been, just how thoughtful the governor's energy office has been, and all of the people that are participating in all of the working groups have been, to this. So thank you to Stephanie and to Amanda and to Damian for just fabulous presentations. And Kathleen, I know this is your show, so back over to you.
So nice to have you on camera though this week, Will, and thank you to Stephanie, Amanda, Damian. You all just gave us an incredible high-level overview of the just enormous amount of work that's going into this process. So thank you. I want to remind everybody, all our Lunch and Learn regulars, as well as new folks, that you will get a follow-up email later this afternoon with a couple of ways that you can continue engaging in the process. So it'll include a link to the meeting schedule. All of those meetings are virtual and open to the public. We'll also include a list to all of the draft recommendations of each of those working groups, including an incredibly user-friendly feedback form so that you can take a look at those recommendations and then put them in order and add your comments and questions. Speaking of comments and questions, I say this every week. It is more true than ever right now. We have so many great questions and we could go all afternoon. I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to keep you all here. It looks like it's lovely outside. So when you get that follow-up email this afternoon, if we didn't get to one of your questions, please just hit reply. It'll come directly to me and I will tap in Stephanie or Amanda or Damian or Will and make sure that you get an answer, because I can already tell we're not going to get to everything that I want to ask, let alone all the things that you all want to ask. So let's get started. Stephanie, I might start with you and just ask, Maine has been working towards offshore wind development for a long time. I appreciate that slide of the timeline. At the same time, our friends in Europe are 10 to 15 years ahead of us in this world. What are we learning from offshore wind development in European waters that can help inform the work we're doing in Maine?
Yeah, great question, Kathleen. We can learn a lot, I think, from Europe. We can learn things like it's important to get our ducks in a row quickly if we want to do a really good job with offshore wind in terms of economic development, but also in terms of doing that in a environmentally an existing user responsible way. So there are existing projects that have been conducting studies that we can extract lessons from. We also have, globally experienced consultants that we've brought in to help provide input to our recommendations, and they've been providing information from their experience in other projects overseas that we can use. I think we're trying to incorporate lessons learned from all over the world, but also from some of the early pilot projects that have been deployed in the United States. So Block Island and the Coastal Virginia project are two examples of that. So there are many pieces we're bringing into the conversation. There's probably a lot more too. So we're always keeping our eyes open and welcome new input.
It seems like just the perfect place. Like we're in this sweet spot where there are lots of examples that we can learn from, and we also have the opportunity to be real leaders. So that's exciting. Amanda, I wonder if you could say a little bit more about what this economic development that you talked about might look like in Knox and Hancock and Waldo counties. What supply chain components could we make here in Maine, or what are those jobs going to look like?
Yeah, I think one of the things that's really fascinating, and my knowledge of this particular industry is from really just my experiences on this committee over the past few months. So I've been learning so much about offshore wind, and I feel like I still have only just barely skimmed the surface. But one of the things that I learned and find absolutely fascinating about it is that there are so many different jobs and sectors involved in the process. And you initially think about it and you're like, okay, so we need what? We need to somehow build this thing, and then we need to put it up and it runs and that's it. And that is so much not the way that actually works. And you think about all of the different components that go into, okay, well, you need to have the onshore infrastructure to be able to sort of assemble this stuff, and you need lots of different kinds of boats involved to be able to help service it and put it together and get it out there, and all of the different components of certainly we're not going to be able to make everything here. Some stuff's going to have to come from other places, but where we do have the opportunity to make pieces of it, we can make pieces of it not just for ourselves, but for other people and ship it off to them. But also, a lot of the services that go along with it as well. I talked a little bit about the research and development aspects of it and being able to train workforce for, not just here, but lots of different places. And so, there are so many different components, and you need all different skill levels involved in that, and all different types of workers. You need everything from sort of day laborers to high-end engineers and people with incredibly specific advanced degrees, and sort of the whole spectrum in between there. And so I think that that's one of the things to keep in mind as we're thinking about this, is that it's an incredibly complex process to develop. And so there are a lot of opportunities at all different levels for people to be involved, and for different parts of the state to be involved in different ways.
That's really exciting. So many of the projects that we talk about meet one of those. There are certain kinds of jobs or certain kind of materials, but you're really describing like the whole package. It's pretty cool. Damian, I have a question for you. I know you've been working on this for a while now, and when we talk about the timeline, there are folks who say we are moving too fast. We've got to do a better, but we've got to slow down. Big changes ahead. There are also folks who say we are dragging our feet. When are we going to solve this? what are the dangers of moving too quickly, moving too slowly? And do you have the brilliant answer to how we balance those?
I'll start by being direct. I do not have the brilliant answer to that question, but I do. So first of all, even the development of a commercial wind farm, in the Gulf of Maine, so call that the largest one that has been permitted in the U.S. is 60 turbines off a vineyard, right? And that's not constructed yet. So if you put a 60 turbine wind farm within the Gulf of Maine, we're not going to solve the climate crisis overnight, right? It's a I guess what we'll call it a silver buckshot, right? It is one important component, and we need to generate more of that electricity. What is, I guess, sometimes frustrating from the standpoint of developing these projects is that even if you start today, it's years away from happening, right? And that's why these working group recommendations are extremely important, so that we can have the data, so that when it does come time for an environmental assessment and an environmental impact statement, we can make the claim that we've looked at all the alternatives. We've chosen the place with the best chance for coexistence with fishery. We've chosen the place that as the best and least chance of interacting with migratory pathways. And that's hard, right? Because a lot of us say, well, make the wind company pay for that. But the wind companies, of course, right, like they want to know where they should go, right, and where they shouldn't go, and where the red flags are. And so we as a community have to, I think, step in and say, these are the places that we think match our values, and help accelerate renewable energy development and transmission and generation. And so that this working group and these working groups are incredibly important at making that balancing act happen. And so that we as the community in Maine get to choose where we think this can happen. And if we take our eye off of that, other interests, right, will eventually help make that decision, right? So I think that's why, I really, really push people to think about getting involved in these working groups and having your opinion heard.
Again, it feels like a really exciting position to be in, that we can sort of shape what we want this to look like, and that it's not a yes or no, right? It's a how. Will, I know that a lot of your work revolves around helping lots of different kinds of people begin to answer that question. And I wonder just what you think we can do to make sure that we have that Maine has the right level of control, even though we have to share the Gulf of Maine with neighboring states, unfortunately, maybe not unfortunately, but it's reality. How do we make sure that our main values and priorities are reflected in whatever offshore wind ends up looking like in the Gulf of Maine?
The fact of the matter is offshore wind is going to be built in the Gulf of Maine, no matter if Maine wants it to be there or not. That is just a simple and inescapable truth. And so I think the question for us is, to what degree would Maine like to benefit from this? And before I worked for MCD, before I did my work on offshore wind and voting rights, before I went to law school and graduate school, I was a public school teacher here in Maine, and I worked with kids, at-risk kids in southern Maine. And I think about, what those kids are doing now. Most of them are, working, kind of minimum wage jobs at pizza shops around Portland, and doing jobs that I believe that they could do more. And I think the question for us as a state is, we know that in the years ahead, we're all going to have to give up a little bit, but I think we can also gain a lot in return. And I think when we talk about the economic opportunities, the opportunities to save so many of the places we love from the effects of climate change, it feels like a cost benefit analysis that's an absolute no-brainer to me. And every day I wake up and I think about those former students of mine, and what kind of jobs I'd like them to be able to do here in Maine, and what I'd like to have the communities. I used to live in Waldo County, what I'd like to have Waldo County look like 10 to 15 years in the future. And so I think, to the extent that we'd like to be in control, you have to, maybe it's a poker analogy, maybe it's something else, but if you want to play, you have to pay to play. And you have to be, willing to say, yeah, we're going to develop offshore wind here. We're going to, land transmission here. We're going to take on, some of the downside, some of the impact, but also we're going to be able to get a lot of the upside. And I think as we think about the transition and the jobs that we're creating in the future, boy, is that exciting. I mean, that's what brings me joy here, is to be able to future vision a Maine that's resilient, that has multiple industries. Again, it's not just offshore wind, it's offshore wind, it's solar, it's onshore wind, it's all of these things together that we work together and we build out supply chains, and I think we're in a better place in 15 years than we are today.
That perspective and enthusiasm is part of why I love doing this work with you, Will, and with you, Stephanie, Amanda, Damian, and with all of you. I mean, this is how we make sure that the clean energy transition in Maine reflects what we care about by being involved. So thank you all for being involved. I was hoping we would get to a few more questions than that, but as I've told you, there are just so many. Please, please, please respond to that follow-up email with anything that is keeping you up at night and anything else, and we will share some ways to get further involved. We do also have a bunch of offshore wind lunch and learns in our program library. So go back and get the fuller scoop on any of those, or let us know. I want a full hour on X, and we love nothing more than being able to program around your interests and needs. So I hope you'll join us next week. We're talking Supreme Court. We are absolutely giddy over the confirmation of Ketanji Brown Jackson to the Supreme Court, and also absolutely anxious about what the conservative majority is going to have to say about the Environmental Protection Agency's authority to regulate carbon dioxide emissions from stationary sources. Whew. This work has so many contradictions. So join us next week to celebrate and commiserate a little bit. Doug Lindner, who is the Advocacy Director for Judiciary and Democracy at LCV, that's the League of Conservation Voters, and Anthony Maffa, who is an Associate Professor of Law at the University of Maine School of Law, will be with us. I hope to see you all there and to hear from you before then. Have a terrific weekend. Thank you all for being with us today.